So I was speaking for myself and what my politics are as a socialist feminist. I see socialist feminism as quite different from being a woman who's a socialist. And it's also does not mean, as some other feminists think it means, feminists who are only interested in women in the workplace or trade union politics or the economic structure of this society. I see socialist feminism, and I think socialist feminism is a fairly new theoretical and practical development in the Western women's liberation movements of the last 10 years, as a critique that says that all people, both men and women, are placed in our society, and how they're placed and how they live, what work they're forced to do, how they do that work, how they experience their own lives emotionally and sexually. All of those things are determined by two systems, and the two systems are capitalism and patriarchy. And when we get to that point, everybody sort of always gets very mixed up and says, sort of sees it as these sort of two competing systems. And there's been a lot of work done on looking at how, in fact, those two systems are so interlinked that you cannot, in many ways, separate them. And a lot of socialist feminists call them either patriarchal capitalism or capitalist patriarchy. And I guess it depends on which of those two things, the term socialist feminist is more dominant in you, which one you'd say it was. And I guess that the term patriarchal capitalism describes a society which is a class society in which work is organised to exploit the labour of the working class for profit. But it's also a society in which men have power over women in nearly all aspects of their lives, and that those two things in fact determine the structure of how capitalism runs, so that at all levels of that society, whether it's within the workplace, within the ruling class, the middle class, or the working class, or outside of the workplace in terms of how people live, that there is sexism which exploits and oppresses women. I don't know if you could call that sort of, I don't know if that's a very clear explanation of what my politics are, or the sort of starting point for what my politics are as a socialist feminist. But that position certainly, I wouldn't say, is the dominant one in the women's liberation movement. So I mean, within feminism, I mean, I suppose just using the term feminism is a politics whereby women challenge the power of men in the society, and I mean that can be done from any number of political standpoints. I mean, there's radical feminism, which in fact says that patriarchy and the power of men is actually the primary oppression for women, and revolutionary feminism, as I understand it, is a more extreme version of that. And then, I mean, there's what is called bourgeois feminism, which is sort of like a sort of women's rights position, which is taken up in lots of organisations. I mean, like the United Nations having sort of, its forums for women worldwide. I mean, they can't be exactly seen to be the most revolutionary organisation in the world, and that's the sort of, that bourgeois feminism is in fact quite a large proportion of, say, the women's liberation, the women's movement in the United States, I think, and accounts for the whole sort of equal rights mentality there. So, I mean, as a socialist feminist who's not aligned to any party, I mean, I see the women's liberation movement as a sort of, as a fairly anarchic at times, expression of women's challenging the position that they are placed in this society. And within that, there are many sort of degrees of organisation, of complexity in terms of different campaigns, and of simplicity in terms of others. But I think that at this point, the extent of political activity in societies such as this is probably broader than it ever has been at any point in the past, in terms of how many people's lives are actually touched by some form of politics. And I think that the women's movement is largely responsible for that, in terms of having actually changed the whole context, or the whole game, if you might see it that way, in that it's changed the whole definition of what politics is about. It's said that politics is not just some sort of game which you have to spend years learning the rules before you're allowed to play, before you're allowed to sort of know the correct meeting procedure to speak at your trade union branch or whatever, but that politics is a process of challenging all the conditions of your life. And in that sense, I think that I, as a socialist feminist, am quite committed to the autonomy of the women's liberation movement, and I see that not only I don't only mean autonomy in terms of as some sort of autonomous central movement which is outside of other structures, for example the trade union movement or political parties, because I think that's an incorrect conception of what the women's movement is, because socialist feminists are in fact very active in all areas of the trade union movement, as evidenced, for example, by the Women's TUC, which was at Scarborough just a couple of weeks ago, and in parties like the Labour Party and the Socialist and Communist parties. But also that we see autonomy as springing from an analysis which actually says that that to some extent men are the enemy of women, in terms of either as individuals in specific situations or as a group, or in terms of sexism, which is a system which defines how people live and how they experience themselves, and which actually actively works to keep women in certain positions in this society in terms of the ideology with which they're socialised to see their sort of main fulfilment in life as coming from being mothers, or from being in love and enduring violent marriages or whatever. That given that many of those things call upon them to fight against sexism, and in many situations to fight against men, that they need to be able to organise separately from men in order to do that. And I think also that in terms of talking about socialism, because or a revolution, I guess no one who calls himself a socialist would nowadays say that they see that only as an economic transformation. I would hope, anyway, that no one would say that. But that I think that the historical, what we now can see as the history of the women's liberation movement, say over the last 15 years in countries like this, has widened the whole arena of politics, so that in fact we get a better and more comprehensive and sharper focus on what the society actually is and what it actually does to people in all areas of their lives, in terms of their health, in terms of what they eat, in terms of the conditions of these cities, in terms of housing. And I think that that feminism, which starts from looking at how women actually feel about their lives, how they feel about their emotional lives, how they feel about contraception, how they feel about pregnancy, and childcare, and their marriages, and how they feel about what clothes they have to wear, what images they have to live up to, how they feel about having to work all day and then go home and have to do the housework. All of those sorts of things actually not only have a bearing on the family as it might be seen to exist as some sort of isolated unit in a house in some street somewhere, but actually make us have to look at the sort of society which of course is ultimately responsible for setting up or perpetuating that system. And I don't think that it's some sort of failure of feminism that, or the women's liberation movement, that it hasn't necessarily in all of those areas challenged or defeated or gone straight to the heart of, whatever multinational corporations, market certain drugs or market certain contraceptives or whatever. I think that that in fact the women's movement, and I think that if you look at a magazine like Spare Rib, you'll see that in fact it has made really gigantic moves all over the world to actually challenging a whole multitude of ways and issues that determine women's lives, and with that also determine men's lives, and that has actually taken the struggle against the sort of society we live in quite a large step closer to I suppose some sort of confrontation or some sort of wide change than I think a lot of the socialist parties have over the last 60 years. So I'll just finish on that note.
Before I start to speak, can I just ask the audience to excuse me if I suddenly stumble for words or mispronounce something, because I'm not actually a native speaker. I'm French, so just to warn you. Right, well, I've come tonight to speak not just as a human being who's decided to become a socialist, but as a woman who's decided that for her, socialism was the answer, the only answer. It is undeniable that a woman today has problems specific to her condition, problems that men do not share and possibly cannot fully appreciate. And these problems have in fact been best described by women themselves. The feminists have done an excellent job of describing the way in which society molds and uses them. Like them, I resent the expectations, I resent the prejudices, the financial difficulties that plague a woman's life. I resent being talked down to as if I was slightly subhuman, or being stared at as if I was a piece of chocolate cake. But these things happen all the time to a woman. So what can I do? If I join the feminists and we get what they're asking for, will that really mean liberation for me? So to answer that question, the first thing to do is to decide what liberation does mean for me. Well, it's quite simple. It means that I'm not materially or financially dependent on anyone. It means that I can think what I like. It means that I can choose the work that I want to do and change that work if I want to change it. It means that I can live where I like and I can live with whom I like. Or alone, if that suits me better. It means that I can have children or not, without that decision making a drastic difference to my whole life. And it also means that I do not have to live under the threat of violence, be it personal violence such as rape or assault, or generalized violence such as war, nuclear war particularly. So now I look at the demands of the women's liberation movement to see what they will give me. For instance, equal pay. But I don't want to be paid for my contribution to the world because I find that humiliating. Equal job opportunity. But I don't want a job. Because if I have a job, it means financial dependence on my employer. It means no real freedom of thought, because if I risk losing a job, I can't really think what I want, or at least I can't say it. It means I can't live where I like, because I have to live where the job is, nor probably live with whom I like, because he or she will probably have a job somewhere else. And it also means that I most probably can't have children, or that it will be very difficult. Another demand, 24-hour nurseries. But do I want my children brought up like battery chicken? Abortion on demand is another one. But is abortion as such something that I want, something that I value? Of course it isn't. What I want is a society where that problem doesn't arise, where we don't have the hang-ups that we have about sex and that we're in full control of it, or where having a child is not such a burden on one individual, namely the mother, that you don't want it. One can imagine that sort of society quite easily. Another demand is wages for housework. Well, I don't want wages, and I certainly don't want housework as a permanent occupation. Another one is the right to sell, feminists have actually fought for this, the right to sell my body sexually without harassment from the police. Well, true, harassment from the police is not something that I want, but nor is having to sell my body sexually. What I want is a society where there is no poverty, so that nobody has to do that sort of thing, because nobody would if they weren't pushed into it by poverty. The right to be a full-time soldier and go into combat is another one. But I have no quarrels with my fellow workers abroad, and they're the people I'd be fighting, not the real enemies, nor any desire to kill anybody. And in the same breath, or perhaps not, perhaps it's a different group of feminists, no to nuclear wars. Well, I agree with that. But that's not enough. It's no to all the wars that we want, not just nuclear war. And then there's a group of demands, sort of a slightly more personal nature, and possibly demanded by the more extremist groups within the feminist movement. The right not to have sex with men, but rather with a woman. The right not to have babies. The right not to be deformed by pregnancy, not to breastfeed. In fact, the right not to be a woman at all. But what if I enjoy being a woman? What if I enjoy making love with a man? What if I feel great when I'm pregnant? And what if I deeply enjoy breastfeeding, like so many women? So I wonder, have I been brainwashed before to enjoy these things? Or am I rather being brainwashed now, no longer to enjoy them? Anyway, whatever the answer to that, having looked at the demands made by the feminist movement, there is one conclusion to be drawn, and that is it will not give me the sort of freedom that I was talking about before. Not at all. In fact, it is gradually giving me a kind of a new mould to fit into, and that mould spells be like a man. So why? Why fight? Spend all this energy fighting out of one oppression straight into another? Is that what women really want? Can it be true? Or is it that something else is happening under the surface? And so I will just leave women for a couple of minutes and take a look at the system as a whole, how capitalism develops. And in order to do this, I shall quote from the very beginning of the Communist Manifesto. And this is what Marx has to say. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Now, if we look at women nowadays, could we not argue that they are possibly one of the last possibly the last, of these subordinate classes within the system that is doomed to disappear, just like all the others have been doomed to disappear, one after the other. And in fact, if we think that that is a plausible thing, and we look at other countries, we realise that if you take a country like France, which I know fairly well, in that country you don't have a very active feminist movement, and I would say that it has, if there is one, it has very little influence over the population as a whole. Well, my experience of France is that women there, I'm not even sure that there's a publication of the women's movement in France. There was one, I know, but I was told that I looked for one, that it had disappeared. But anyway, in France, women tend to work far more than they do here. They have better facilities for creches, for babies and the like, and the pressure on them is to have a baby, look after it for a couple of months and then go back to work. So it would seem, but I mean some people here disagree, but it would seem that without a very strong feminist movement within the whole of the population anyway, this is happening anyway. If you take Italy, on the other hand, which is a fairly still backward country as a whole, there is a very strong, very active feminist movement there, and yet the women are not yet going to work because the country is not ready for it, in spite of the fact that there is a very strong feminist movement, very active. So, if this is what is going on, that it is a force within capitalism which is bringing about what is happening to women, then we would expect the feminists not to be revolutionary at all. We would expect them to be a small minority of women who are aware of this trend and who are for some reason in favour of it, and I think quite sincerely believing that it will improve women's lot, but not in a revolutionary way. And in fact, the feminists do not question the system. I would say that feminist thinking takes place entirely within the present system of values. They analyse their own situation, but not the system as a whole. And I will now quote from a book called The Woman Question, edited by Mary Evans. In her introduction, on page 13, she says, "Women's entry into paid employment has given them greater financial independence and autonomy, but it is still the case that in terms of social power and control, women remain less privileged than men." And our friend here, Susan, said more or less the same thing, that men had all the power. But I ask you, what sort of social power and social control do you, the men here, have? Does the average man have? What can you do about the problems, about everything? So, let us now look at men. Well, if I look at men, I see them divided in two simple classes. On the one hand, about 10% of them, at the most, probably, they're the capitalist men. They're the ones who own everything. They own the means of production, the land, everything, and they employ other people to produce the wealth, and they can afford all the luxury products. These are about 10%. On the other hand, you have the workers. All of them. 90% of the men are workers. I know that some of them are better off. They seem quite well off. Some of them are in the news all the time. Their voices are heard on the radio. Their faces are seen on television. They seem important. But nevertheless, they are dependent on their job for their existence. Without that job, they're finished. And so, I say that only the 10% have any real social power and social control. So we can't really say that it is all men who are in that position. So how did that idea come about, that it is all the men who hold the social power and the social control? Well, I would say it comes about from a kind of false logic which goes like this. Those who hold social power and control are men. I mean, that's true. Therefore, being a man means that you hold social power. But that's not true. Not if you're not in those 10%. Not if you don't own the means of production and the land and all that. Of course, one problem is that all the men, the 100% of them, encourage this way of thinking. And in fact, they behave, all of them, as if the world belonged to them, talking as if they were in the know, and generally strutting about and looking important. I mean, there's no denying that.
Apart from socialists.
No, I wouldn't even say that. And what is women's reaction to this? Do they tell the men, look at you fools, you're trying to look important, but you're nothing, you're no more than me? Do they do that? No. They're impressed. They want to be like the men. In other words, they're completely taken in, which, for capitalism, is fine. Because you see, if people have all kinds of fuzzy notions about who really holds power, all the better for the capitalists, because then people won't cause trouble for the people who really hold power. And if everybody's dream and ambition is to become a wage slave, then capitalism is as healthy as it can hope to be. So, because I say that feminism does not question the system, I say that it cannot solve the problems, and I will now compare it with another way of thinking, which is socialism. And I will wonder whether there is any sort of relationship between the women's movement and socialism. And if I look at feminism, I say feminism identifies the cause of women's problems as being men. Men are the enemy, so Susan said before, and so most feminists say. We say the system is the enemy. So by saying that, the feminists, instead of attacking the system that produces the kind of men that they don't like, they attack those men. And they try to get, instead of questioning the system, they think of other remedies within the system, reforms that cannot possibly liberate women, because the reforms leave wage slavery there. And as long as we've got slavery of any kind, nobody can be liberated, especially if 90% of the population is within that system of slavery. Besides which, the remedies that the women's movement, the remedies that they're asking, that they want to implement, may well bring about side effects and bring about new problems, such as you can imagine the situation where, for instance, women could no longer raise their children if they chose to. Because if all women become wage slaves, then perhaps it will not be considered of interest to the employer to allow them to look after 1 or 2 children when a woman can look after 30, that kind of thing. Or you can imagine new liberation movements having to be organized, such as a children's liberation movement for the right of children to be brought up at home by someone who loves them rather than by someone who's paid to look after them. So, feminism is in a sense reformist. Socialism is in a sense revolutionary. Socialism wants to change the system radically. And this is why it has nothing to do, feminism and socialism have very little to do with each other. Socialists say capitalism is at the root of all the problems that we're suffering from at the moment. So if we want to get rid of any of these problems, or of all of them, capitalism has to go. As long as it stays, the problems, including women's problems, remain in one form or another. Its abolition is the only thing worth fighting for a woman as well as for a man, because the abolition of capitalism will mean the abolition of private property. Not that you can't have your own toothbrush anymore. No, that's not what it means. It means that nobody will be able to accumulate wealth and own land and factories, etc., and employ people to work in them. That's what it means. And that means that there will be no social control by any minority of men or women over the rest of society, and that means that nobody has control over anybody else. The abolition of capitalism will also mean the abolition of money and wages. And that means that nobody will be financially, materially dependent on anybody else. It will mean the abolition of the capitalist class and of the working class. There won't be any classes anymore, which means there won't be any conflicts between the two classes and the sort of struggles that we have to go through all the time, the strikes and all that, to keep our wages as high as possible. It also means that if the capitalist class disappears, conflicts between the various sections of the capitalist class, the French one and the Russian one and the Chinese one and the American one, disappear as well. And they're the source of war, and therefore war disappears. And for the first time ever, we can live in peace, complete peace. Not nuclear war, just no wars at all. Now, all this spells much more like the freedom I was describing at the beginning of my talk than what the feminists are trying to achieve. And lastly, I would like to quote something from the Declaration of Principles of the Socialist Party of Great Britain. And it goes like this. It says, "The emancipation of the working class will involve the emancipation of all mankind without distinction of race or sex. All women of all races and all men of all races will be equal." And so we see that if socialism has very little to do with the women's movement, it has, on the other hand, everything to do with the liberation of women. Only a society that has become free of all slavery can provide real liberation, real freedom to all its members. Because indeed, as Susan was saying, that she hoped socialism would not be only an economic transformation. Well, it will be an economic transformation, of course, to start with. It has to be. But then, all these other things will follow. And so, this is why I would say to all women who suffer from their oppression, as I do not waste your time and precious energies fighting for a variation of the present oppression. Join us and say with us that you want nothing short of real liberation and that you will fight and vote for nothing less.
Well, shall we open up on questions and discussion? Lady here.
Well, I must say I was quite concerned that a member of the Socialist Party of Britain should have got apparently all their knowledge of feminism from the capitalist press, because your attack on feminism was exactly that which is commonly made by the capitalist press and the conservatives in our society. It seems to me that the points made by the first speaker were an addition to socialist theory, rather than in any way challenging or putting different priorities. There was an explanation of why some women might put different priorities. But I thought the first speaker was putting her remarks in the context of a socialist analysis, particularly that there is a strength that the women's movement has tapped to challenge the forms, all sorts of forms that have developed in capitalism, within capitalism. So women have challenged, even bourgeois women who don't have much political theory maybe, have nonetheless challenged forms that have come out of capitalism, that are specifically capitalist. So, I mean, this is one of the sort of contradictions that arises in capitalism, of course. And I think it's one that socialists should, if they're really interested in change and in challenge and in the way society operates, take note of. There are specific instances where women have, in fact, challenged multinational companies. For instance, I'll give one example, the Nestle's product, which is sold to third world women, and the whole question of the position of third world women, which is taken up by some feminists. In fact, most serious feminists that I know about are socialists, and I think that your whole attack on feminism was trivialising this whole issue, which is such a crucial one, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, to answer first the thing about the fact that my attack on feminism was the sort of attack in the press, I can't quite understand that, because What I said was that the reason feminism would not bring about real liberation to women was that it did not question and attack the system, that it did not want to completely restructure the system in which we're living. Now, I've never read that. I'd be delighted if I could read that in the capitalistic press and the everyday papers, but I've never seen that said anywhere. Now, can I finish? Can I finish answering the question? Now, you said that Susan had put her points, and that her points were in addition to socialism. But I've got to come back to something I've said in the talk. Susan said men are the enemy. I say the system is the enemy. There's a very basic difference there. You can't hold the two together, and you can't say that saying men are the enemy is in addition to saying the system is the enemy. I don't see that at all. Now, about bourgeois women having no theory, I think the vast majority of women have no theory. I think that possibly the women that do have some sort of feminist theory are more likely to be from the bourgeois class, well, what you mean probably by bourgeois, that is sort of fairly well off or educated or whatever, than otherwise. And, well, that's all. I mean, I wasn't quite sure what you meant about the third world women, so I can't really say anything on that.
Would you like to say something before?
Yeah. I mean, I think Christine's taken what I said out of context, because I said that in the context of looking at the whole of our society and how that runs, and that within the context of a capitalist system which exploits workers for profit, etc., there is also a system whereby men have more social power than do women, and that women are exploited and are oppressed. And that I think that it's really false to say the system is the enemy, and you can't say that men are the enemy, because, I mean, who is the system? I mean, we are all placed within the system. We all have our place within the system. And in specific instances of oppression of women, violence against women, rape of women, battering of women by their husbands, you cannot sort of point to a system and say that's what's responsible. I mean, you may in the long run be able to sort of have an overall view which sort of shows you how that happened, what's responsible for that, what forces led to that happening. But in terms of actually fighting against what's happening to you, most women end up saying that at this point that particular man or those men are my enemy in this situation, and they will fight against that. And I mean, I support that. So, I mean, that's the context in which I said that.
Yeah. Would you like to?
I mean, very simple question. I'm asking that, you said in socialist society, everybody's at war, there's no sex division or something like that. I'm asking, corresponds with the bourgeoisie, when take feudalism, said every single person in bourgeoisie wanted to take war. I'm asking in the society that the men are dominate women. When the actual freedom just in the world, when women have to bear for 9 months children, have to do domestic work, have they are subordinate psychologically, and the man going out, reading book, taking every single step that bring the advantage of my system. How can mean this equality if not the woman fight the man to bring them in every demand they want to the materialist equality, not in the world? I mean, how the word of equality that you mean, it is the same patriotic, socialism. I mean, how can be like that?
Well, I'll answer this question then. Well, I don't dispute at all that women are badly treated in this society. No, I don't dispute that. I'm one of them and I know it. But men are badly treated as well, you see. This is the problem. 90% of men are also slaves. They're slaves to a system which exploits them. And so the result of this is that they have to fit into a certain mold, just as I do, And this mould tells them that they've got to be the way they are, that is not caring and not nurturing, because their job is to go out and work in the factories and in the fields and all that. And so what I'm saying is that if the men become like that because the system makes them like that, what's the point of attacking the men? You've got to attack the cause of the problem, not the symptom. I mean, you can bash all the men over the head. If the system's still there, my sons will turn out the same no matter what I do to them. So I go to the root of the problem and I say that's what we've got to eradicate.
Can I ask something? I mean, when the working class man sit at home, cook baby care, washing dishes, not I mean, accepting, I mean, the woman do every single that the wife does for them, and sitting watching TV or going pub drinking the pint and talking with the fellow man, and taking book to reading, discussing politics, and the woman being slave in the house, in the home. Every single working class in this society, it is man. The same as capitalism exploits man. 50% of man exploit 50% of woman in every single step. And this is, I mean, you cannot say that the capitalist system, it is the woman and man capitalist system. The capitalist system is man's capitalist system.
Can I answer that? Well, can I just say that I don't consider it such a marvellous privilege to be able to watch the telly and go drinking in pubs. I don't think that that's such a marvellous way of life at all. I pity the men who have to live like that. I would say that possibly it's no better or no worse than what the woman is. I mean, I'm not arguing, but I'm just saying that from an outside point of view, what I would like is that for both men and women, a far better life than that. Because we are not meant to do this. We are human beings. We have created this absolutely incredibly marvellous technological society. That's what we've done. And what do? We sit at home and watch the telly and go to pubs drinking, and you think that's a privilege. You don't realise the potential in human beings that is not used.
Excuse me.
I mean, it's scary. I mean, that's
Could Susan put her point of view, please?
Yeah, I think that the whole point about political change is that you don't just sort of make huge leaps from what your present lot in life is to some sort of total freedom the next year or whatever. I mean, you have to start from where you are. And that women aren't, the majority of women aren't even sort of free in terms of challenging the capitalist system or the conditions in the workplace because of the oppression that they suffer and the position that they're put in terms of families and their position under and below men. So that women who say, for example, I mean, if we're talking about sort of challenging capitalism for a working woman, I mean, the conditions whereby she can become active in the workplace aren't even there if she has to look after her children, do the housework and look after the children. If she's sort of constantly, run down, really tired, doesn't have the self-confidence to speak at meetings because of the whole sort of way in which women are socialised, etc., etc. And it's no good for women to sort of to just take the position that, well, men are oppressed in that situation as well. I mean, I don't think that any socialist feminists are denying that working class men are degraded and exploited in this society. But when women act in their own interests and when their interests involve overthrowing capitalism as well as working for their own liberation, then they must start at the point of challenging the way men, their husbands or their fathers or whatever, treat them and expect them to do certain things before they can even start challenging other conditions in their lives.
Lady at the back. Oh, in the middle, yeah.
I just few points about some things that Kristen said. The first thing I'd like to make is I was surprised to hear the Socialist Party of Great Britain describing this as class who are about to disappear. I mean, I don't know if she realises, but in saying that, she's aligning herself with some of the most extreme sections of the women's movement. What do women's class produce? What do they sell? What do they have that's analogous to labour power? What do they produce that's analogous to value? They produce babies, okay, but which part of the baby constitutes surplus value? Is it the head? Is it the leg? Is it the hand? Or what is it?
Right.
I'm surprised.
Yeah.
That's one point. The second point, I was surprised too to hear her say that in those countries which are relatively backward in the capitalist system, the capitalist part of the world, the feminist movement is strong, whereas correspondingly that in those countries which are not relatively backward, the feminist movement is correspondingly not so strong. What about the United States, which as far as the league of capitalist countries goes is one of the strongest, and certainly it's not as strong as Japan, if you want to think in these terms, but it is one of the strongest capitalist economies, and it's also the country where the women's movement, at least in some terms, some way of understanding this, is the strongest. Another point, she quotes the Socialist, one of the claims of the Socialist Party, which is that socialism will involve the emancipation of all mankind, irrespective of class, race, or sex. Well, why is the Socialist Party still using the expression mankind when a lot of people have shown, a lot of writings have shown that the word man is systematically ambiguous, as including the male and the female gender, and as sometimes only including the male gender. A lot of writings have shown this, and I could give some examples if people wanted me to, in order to justify this. I don't think it's just a trivial fact. There are, I could give some examples. And I think the final point I'd like to make is that not all women who describe themselves as feminists would say that men, as opposed to the system, are or is the enemy. A lot of feminists, I think, would say that it is the system, and the system contains at least two parts. There is the class structure on the one hand, but there is also another system of oppression. And that second system is in some ways as fundamental as the first and needs to be done away with, as was the first. I think the speaker here talked about the psychological, and perhaps, some people would use the word ideological, and perhaps this may be a word which doesn't have a very clear sense. But the psychological power that men have exercised over women, which won't necessarily be done away with when classes are done away with, which may have to do with the differential nurturing processes that boy and girl children receive, which may have to be eliminated by means of a different sort of revolution, possibly from the socialist revolution. And I'm not saying that all feminists would believe that.
Do you both want to reply to
Yes,
that?
I'll just trying to note everything. Well, I'll try to answer. Why did I call women a class? Well, quite simply because I was quoting from Marx, and he was describing all the various social gradations as classes. He says in almost all these classes, again, subordinate gradations, and I just used the word class in that context. Quite obviously, I know that our analysis is that there are two classes and there is not a third class, but I did say a subordinate class. I did not say one of the classes making society. And I would still say that within the working class, women are can be considered a subordinate class. Now, what do women produce? Can they be considered as a class? Because they don't produce anything. Women produce the most important thing. They produce human energy. Human energy and human labour is what makes the world. So it is by far the most important thing to produce, and that's what they do. Now, to come back to American women, now you missed my point there, because my point was not that there was a connection between the strength of the capitalism and the strength of the women movement. My point was that there was no connection between the feminist movement in different countries and the fact that women went to work. And what I meant was that and in fact that's true of America, because I don't think that there are all that women that work in America in proportion as compared to other countries. So that seems to work. That the fact that there is a very strong feminist movement does not mean that women will go to work. And so you can't say that one is the cause of the other. You can say that certain forces within capitalism push along in a certain direction, but it's got not necessarily any link with the feminist movement. Now, about mankind, I actually agree with you. I do believe that for most people, when they talk about the history of man and of mankind and all that, they think of men. The image in their minds is that of a man. I totally agree. You don't change language by deciding that you're going to change it. I mean, that's the problem.
That's the way you do it.
Well, you can't. You can use humankind, and I think.
Can I remind you, we're not at a bloody rugby or a hockey match. If you've got any questions, ask them through the chair.
I think that, that quite possibly if members within the Socialist Party of Great Britain and, possibly particularly women suggested this, perhaps it would be agreed. But on the other hand, the Socialist Party, as I said before, is not particularly out to change conditions within the present system. The women and the men within the Socialist Party are all fighting for a society where there will be no distinction of race or sex. That's the important thing, not the fact that they use the word mankind or humankind at the moment. And there is a third thing, that there are two systems of oppression at the moment. One is the general class system between the two classes, and then within that, the second system, or equal to that. But, my analysis of that is simply that the second system stems from the first, and therefore if you want to get out of the second, then you've got to get rid of the first. That's
just taking up one small point from that, the use of language. And I think that the way that language is really important in terms of the way in which we describe the world around us. And socialists, Marx, created new concepts and new words. Sort of surplus labour, wage labour, all those sorts of expressions were actually sort of like new words, new concepts that enabled us for the first time to see what was going on in our society. And so I don't think that anyone could deny the power of words. So to just look at the way in which sexism works through language, so that words like man are used to cover the whole of humanity rather than just men, it is a very important step to take for women to stop being invisible, because the whole of the way in which we're educated, the whole sort of history that we're taught in schools is not only the history of class, so that, say, when we learn the history of Britain, all we hear about is sort of like what royalty has done and sort of like who fought certain wars, and we never actually find out much about what the great mass of people, what their living conditions have been. But even within that, the history that we have known about, or that we learn in school, is the history of what men have done, and there's just this great blank in our minds as to what were women doing all that time, what sort of lives were they leading. And I think it's been a really tremendous sort of step for the women's movement, and there's a huge amount of literature on this, to actually uncover that history and to make visible what women's lives have been, and to change the sort of language by which we describe history and also describe what our present lives is a very important thing to do.
Any other? Yeah.
Most of the things that you criticised about the women's movement were all short-term suggestions that the women's movement have made. For example, what you said about abortion. All feminists believe what you said about abortion, what you believe, that it would be wonderful if it was a society in which you could have your baby because you wouldn't feel you would be lumbered with it, and therefore it was too much of an obligation. But at the same time, they believe that if they want an abortion tomorrow, that society isn't going to be there tomorrow, and therefore they will want that abortion. And I do think it's very unfair. All the things you suggested were short-term suggestions by the women's movement, and they do have more radical long-term suggestions. But I think it's unfair to criticise them just for being short-term suggestions, and in that even socialists take short-term action whilst they wait for this revolution.
Yes, can I answer that? Well, on the personal level, I mean, if women come to socialism through feminism, I think I said in the speech, that to me is the logical conclusion. They should become aware of their oppression, just as men have to become aware of their oppression before they become socialists. They have become aware of what's being done to them and becoming indignant about that, and then deciding, I'm going to get rid of this system. Women do the same. And I said feminists have done a very good job at describing what was going on. I mean, they helped me no end. And then you realize what's going on, and then you look at what they want, and then you decide that, possibly you want the lot. Not just a few bits here and there that may not come to anything anyway, but you want the lot. So I agree with you there. That's how it's bound to happen, and I don't criticize feminists for having done that job. It's a very good job. All I'm saying is that what I would like is for women to come to the same conclusion as me. That is that what we've got to fight for is socialism. And that brings me to your second point, the bit about the sort of short-term or even slightly longer-term reforms while waiting for the movement. And that also ties in with what Susan said before about there are no sudden leaps. You don't suddenly go from one thing to something. Well, the problem with this, you see, is that you can't do everything at once. So if you're working for reforms within the system, you're not working for socialism. And while you're working for reforms within the system, what you are really saying is the system is okay. If it wasn't, I wouldn't be working to reform it. It's okay, I just want a few changes here and there. And if you do that, you're not saying the system is not okay, which is what we've got to say. And that's why we socialists do not deal with reforms at all. We do not do little things while waiting. We fight for the end product, because otherwise we won't get it. You see, if you want a brick house, right, but you think, well, I'm not sure that I'm going to have enough bricks and maybe I won't be able to, and you say, well, I'll build a wooden one instead. Well, one thing you're sure of is that by the end of your work, you won't have a brick house, you'll have a wooden one. And because wood is not very solid, the first gust of wind may blow it to pieces and you will have wasted your time.
So are you therefore happy for it to get worse and worse and worse and worse, and maybe sacrificing people's lives in the meantime? I mean, it might not happen for a very long time.
Well, has the system got better? I mean, reformists have been working. They've been doing this job for at least centuries.
Can you
No, I'm sorry. Socialism has not been tried anywhere ever. But reformism has been tried for at least 100 years, and really far more. It's been tried for the whole of history. People have been trying to change the system, and we're still doing it. So it's pretty obvious that it's not working.
Excuse me, we've had your bit. Do you want to comment on that?
I mean, I can only say the same thing again, because I still think it's really unclear from what Christine's saying as to what fighting for socialism means. I mean, what does it actually mean? I mean, how do I, as a socialist, go out and fight for socialism tomorrow?
Define socialism.
Well, I see social... I don't know if I want to define.
You said a lot about socialism, you haven't defined it yet.
Excuse me, we're getting into a disorderly rabble again. There's a young woman in the middle over on the left. And hang on.
I haven't finished what I was saying.
Well, excuse me, Christine hasn't finished what she was saying.
I haven't finished what I was saying, which was that I mean, it's very hard to give a definition of socialism when asked to give a definition of socialism off the top of my head.
You've been saying you're a feminist socialist all night, and you can't define socialism.
No, I'm just saying it's difficult for me to give one straight away. I'll have to just think about it for a second. Well, I'm just saying that I'd see socialism as a situation where all people have a say in how the society is run, in which all differences, power differences between people are combated, because I don't think that there can ever be a society that's static and where groups of people or of men or whatever don't try and take power or don't get power from owning certain things, where there is no private ownership of the means of production, where those things are all owned in common, where the products of those of labour is owned in common and distributed to people, you know, from each according to her needs or whatever, as Marx said. I mean, it's really difficult to. That it's still not clear to me from what Christine was saying how a society such as that can be fought for without fighting at the moment, fighting against the things that are done to us in this society. Because, I mean, the things that are done to us are quite material. I mean, when you go to work, I mean, you're working with objects, you're working in buildings, you're working in a given sort of system of authority. You know, you live as a human material being in the world. I mean, you live in cities in certain conditions, certain housing conditions, you eat certain food, you know, you have sex, you take contraceptives if you're heterosexual, you may become pregnant. All of these things sort of have an actual physical impact on you, and in order to sort of actually live your own life, you have to deal with those things and fight against those things, because they are all sort of being propagated by huge forces, huge economic and social forces in this society. And unless we fight against them step by step, then I don't see how we can all just sort of sit here sort of doing nothing until suddenly we're going to achieve socialism. I mean, it just seems incomprehensible to me.
Excuse me, you haven't had your hand up.
And it's a revolution. Most women in this world would not be able to play any role at all in making a better society. And I think you're sitting here saying either or. Well, I'm not a very good speaker, but it just seems to me that we need both. One in the meantime and one eventually. And there's very little need for you to be perhaps criticising each other or debating the point.
And a woman, in a way, should fight for socialism even more than a man, because if the tendency, as I see it, is to turn everybody into wage slaves, and at the moment most men are wage slaves, so it's to turn women now into wage slaves, the woman doesn't stand a very good chance. It's obvious, because she's got the children problem. And you see, so if the woman is going to be a good wage slave, it means that she's not going to be allowed to look after her children. And if she wants to look after her children and raise them in the way she wants, then she cannot be a good wage slave for that reason, the number of years that she can give to her employer. And if she can't give the same number of good years, and if she can't give the employer the assurance that she's not going to have to sort of miss work because of the children, then she just won't be taken on. So as a wage slave, she stands a worse chance than a man. And so it's even more in her interest to fight for socialism than it is in the man's.
The young lady.
I'm just wondering what you're arguing about. Are people here disputing the fact that there are other forms of oppression in capitalist society, where people are oppressed as workers, as blacks, and as women? And how do those people go about struggling against that form of oppression? I mean, you seem, I'm not clear about what your answer to that is. I mean, how do people organise? I think it's obvious that black people need to organise as black people and as socialists. Women need to organise as women and as socialists. What is wrong with that?
Who wants to?
Can I? Well, I'll just say to that how do people go about fighting oppression? Yes, they do organise. But if their aim is socialism, why should they organise as women? Or why should they organise as blacks? No, let people... No, I don't see the point. I don't see the point at all. The point is for as many people as possible to organise for socialism, which is the only cure for everybody's problems.
But I mean, if But if a black person is being, taken in by the police and beaten up in the cells, and if they're being... Sorry? But I'm saying if a black person is being taken in and beaten up by the police and feels that there is an added ferocity to that because he or she is black, then I don't see that what you're saying is any answer to what he or she might feel that they want to do about that.
What would be the answer?
Well, I think it's up to the people who that is happening to organise and fight against that as they see it, and in fact they are doing that. But I don't think it's any answer to say to them, fight for socialism. Those are just empty words.
Hang on.
I'd like to answer, I didn't quite manage to answer the question from the person over there, which was, in what way do people organise? Well, they decide what they want, and when they're all sure that they want the same thing, which is the case in the Socialist Party of Great Britain, they get together and they find ways of trying to convince other people that what they want is the best thing for everyone. And eventually, when there are enough people wanting that thing, then that thing happens. That thing is socialism. It is a society which Susan said before she couldn't describe socialism, and then she described it. And then she said a society where the means of production are not owned by a minority, they're owned in common, and when the products of production are owned in common and distributed, or sort of people help themselves with that, she described it very well. But then she said it can't happen, it's impossible. I don't know why she thinks it's impossible, but she did. She said that. Surely everyone is a witness. She said, I can't see that being possible. But that is socialism. It is that sort of society. Now, if you don't think that that's possible, then my job as a socialist is to try and convince you that it's possible.
Excuse me, there are a lot of people wanting to put their point of view. Can you keep it short? There's a gentleman at the back who's been wanting to speak for ages.
I'm speaking as a mere male. It's a predominantly female accent, right? Two things. One, I'd like to do this business about men being the enemy of women, right? Because even when situations have occurred where women have taken power, and I'll tell you Indira Gandhi in India, and Golda Meir in Israel, and let me not tell you, Mrs. Thatcher in this country, right? Have things improved? Wait for life if you want, and then go back to Amsterdam River. Have things improved? Have things improved for people, men or women, in these countries? Because it's the system. Individuals, when in power, can't influence the system. Secondly, I'll put this to you. You talk about men strutting around, they think they own everything, they think they know everything. I wouldn't be here if I thought I knew everything, and all the other blokes be here if they thought they knew everything. But I'm coming here because I've got the answers. Right? But do the women let me into their meetings?
Sorry?
Do the women, with these women's meetings, they say no men allowed. They don't fucking let me in there.
Can I say something? You put your finger on the answer yourself when you said when individuals take power. As socialists, we're looking at mass movements. We're looking at the mass of people. We're not just looking at individuals. And of course, within a what is called a democratic society, as say Britain is organised, for one woman to be at the top of that system is not going to make much difference to the position of women, particularly when that woman has really reactionary politics. No feminist will deny. No feminist is saying all women are intrinsically good, feminism is a politics. It's a political position, and it's a political fight and struggle and what you do with your life, and not all women are feminists, and Margaret Thatcher or Golda Meir certainly aren't. So as feminists, we're certainly not looking to get individual women into positions of power. We're looking at how to change the conditions of the mass of women's lives.
With the girl with the whatever it is on. Yeah.
I want to ask, do you deny that there's particular oppression to blacks and to women, and that they don't need their space? Don't you think that women and blacks need a space to think, to talk, to try and fight their particular oppression? Do you just see it as this sort of just bland mass of people within a capitalist system?
Yes.
Can I answer that? Can I answer that? Well, do you deny that men are oppressed?
I deny that men are. I think that men oppress women. I think that men are oppressed in a capitalist society. That I think that the biggest evil is patriarchy, because I think patriarchy creates capitalism. I don't think capitalism creates patriarchy.
Well, I'd like to answer what you said. You think that men oppress women,
Yes.
right? So you've not answered my question. But anyway, now I'd just like to point something out that people seem to forget. I think most psychologists today agree that the formative years for the personality of a child are the first 5 years, or before 6 or something like that. A lot has been written about that. Now, in the first 5 or 6 years of the life of a child, who is in control? Women. The mother, and most primary school teachers are women, and most of the friends of the mother are women. So, if women wanted their children to develop in a different way, if they wanted their sons to be caring and friendly instead of aggressive, they could treat them in a certain way. But I've seen quite the reverse.
So you blame the mother?
No, wait a minute. Can I finish, please? Can I finish what I'm saying? Right. Now, I don't blame the mothers at all. Wait a minute. What I am saying is that quite obviously everybody is thinking in the same way, men and women, about values. They're all thinking in that way in spite of the fact that it's not in their interest. And they're thinking it that way because the whole system, the structure, the system of values that we live in is that, and we all absorb it, men and women. So I'm not blaming anybody. I'm blaming a system, and I'm fighting a system, and I want a new system instead that will not produce these values.
There was a lady. Yes, you had your hand up. No, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I just want to go back to Barbara's point about organisation. I can only speak from Australian experience as well. And one of the things that I've been involved in Australia is migrants and women's, particularly migrants and migrant women and women generally in the trade union movement. And one of the things that I'm a socialist feminist as well. And one of the huge problems that migrant people had in Australia in terms of trying to get some sort of say within the trade union movement about their particular needs was because of their lack of language and their lack of power positions within the trade union movement. The power position between the Australian whites and migrants was maintained very, very fiercely. And unless migrants organised in their own separate organisation within the trade union movement for 10 years, the trade union movement totally rejected them. They started to organise outside. The same with women. Now, I've been to lots of trade union meetings where trade unionists say we will take into account the particular needs of women. And what happens? 2% of positions in trade union movements go to women. How can women's interests be represented if only something like 2%, and in some cases nil, when the actual membership of some trade unions in Australia is 70 and 80% non-English speaking migrants? Now, if you can't talk about different forms of organisation to make the working class movement a much more viable and useful oppositional structure, then what are you talking about? Some kind of rigid, homogeneous working class which doesn't exist. Racism exists, sexism exists, and you have to have parallel struggles. And for men to keep on denying that there's no oppression of women and that women can somehow reach a liberation through socialism, I mean, what's happening in the Soviet Union and Cuba? The ideological struggle is a really practical one.
Which of you two would like to answer that question? Can you just let other people have their say, please?
Well, I'd like to answer it, yes. Well, I think what you said about these migrants shows very well the futility of fighting within the system. If you want to organise in an organisation where everyone is welcome on exactly the same footing, join the Socialist Party of Great Britain.
None of the parties have equal representation of migrants. Name any of the parties in Australia. None of them have high representation of migrants. None of them have high.
No, sorry, you misunderstood me. I said join the Socialist Party of Great Britain.
Great Britain. Is that the only socialist party in the world?
One in Australia.
You have to excuse me. Do you want to answer on that?
No, I completely agree.
I forgot the order of people that had the hand up.
Clifford had his head up.
But was this gentleman in the yellow
Yeah.
thing that...
I'd like to make a few points on this from my own experience, and I hope that the person who's been elected to take the chair for the evening will be allowed to do her job, which is to allow me to speak uninterrupted, because I heard this question by some people. It's a very simple point, really, and that is that if you're in favour of democracy, which means each person gets their chance to speak, you elect one person to be in charge of making sure that happens. If you don't, the alternative to that is that the person with the loudest voice, which might not be you, it might be somebody over there, is going to dominate the affair.
No, here.
No, well, you're objecting the existence
Can we
of
have a
the
bit
chair.
of consideration for the speakers?
Now, what I'd like to say is that I think there's a false distinction which has been set up in this discussion between the liberation of women and between socialism. And I think that what the socialist speaker said earlier on has been overlooked or misrepresented, because to me what she said quite clearly was that she recognised that women are oppressed. That hasn't been denied by any men or women here. She went on to say quite clearly, to my mind, that the only way in which women could achieve their liberation was through socialism. That's the nature of the argument. That there was no other way in which women could achieve their liberation other than through socialism. So men and women at the moment are both conditioned to accept capitalism. Whatever you say about men and their attitude towards women, one thing you must agree, that most men support capitalism. Most men support the kind of social relationships which you've got between employer and employee, and between them the fact that we've got a society which is class divided and which is based upon producing profit for a minority economically rather than producing the needs of all. So therefore both men and women have got to get out of that conditioning if they're going to revolutionise society. Now the kind of social relationships which men and women have been socialised into are obviously very complex. It's not just the relationship between a boss and his worker or her worker. It's also the relationship between people on a more immediate level. But that's still part of a network of social relationships which is ultimately, in the final analysis, determined by the economic drive towards producing profit. Quite clearly so, because of the fact that male workers are going to factories, going to offices, and are put through conditions just as are women workers, which are geared towards producing a profit for a minority. Now secondly, I'd like to say that if women are conditioned at an early age to see themselves as subordinate to men, which they almost certainly in most cases unfortunately have been, then obviously it's up to those women to get on with it and to get out of that conditioning and to stop seeing themselves as subordinate to men. So let's assume that the women who are here have done so. Let's assume that the women who are here have successfully got rid of their early conditioning when they were very young, which taught them that they are subordinate to men and taught them a lot of other things as well. Obviously that's not enough. Women have to reject the conditioning which has made them support the system just as men have to. Now if I was to start behaving as from tonight as what you might describe as a typical woman, a conventional woman, just as if the speakers tonight were to start behaving as from tomorrow morning, trying to imitate the behaviour of typical conventional men with their macho attitudes and all the rest of it, we would be no nearer socialism. Obviously we would have just swapped places. Therefore, to have a revolutionary change in society, both men and women have got to revolutionise their own behaviour and their own attitudes. Now, thirdly, I would like to say that I have a particular experience. Owing to the nature of the work that I do, I've had 2 jobs in which my employer has been a woman. Now, I appreciate this is not a particularly general experience, it just happens to have been what's happened to me. Now, again, particular experience, I was sacked from both of those jobs by women. Now, you're right if you think that this has a danger of souring my attitude and making me biased in a certain way. But it does prove a point. It does undoubtedly prove a point to all of us. Because I've been employed, because of the nature of the work I do, in small units of organisation, and there's only been 2 or 3 employees. And it's been a small business because of the kind of work it is. And there have, in both cases, been women who have owned that business. Now, I'm not saying therefore that women's position is inherently superior or something. I'm simply saying that this really proves the point that the problem in society is not very sensibly summarised as one in which men oppress women. In those relationships when I was sacked, for various reasons, which I think is quite unfair, there's no doubt that in each of those situations, the woman in question, in both of those situations, the woman in question had power over me. There's actually no doubt about that. She sacked me. Now, the reason she had power over me, of course her husband may have had power over her, I don't know about that, but she had power over me. And the reason she had power over me was that she owned the business. It's as simple as that. Now, if you look at the register of shareholders of Unilever, which is a company which has a turnover which is higher than the annual government budget of Switzerland, the shareholders of that company do include women. Now, I appreciate it might be only a few of the shareholders fair enough. But nevertheless, it does prove a point that you haven't made a serious analysis if you simply say men oppress women. Because in these cases I'm quoting you, in a sense, there are women oppressing men. Therefore, you've got to look further. You've got to look further for the real problem. And I would argue that the real problem, obviously, as the speakers argued, is an economic one. Essentially, it doesn't mean that it's exclusively an economic one. In other words, when you have problems of domestic violence, which have increased remarkably over the last 10 years, probably as a result of the recession, when you have problems of alcoholism or problems of psychiatric disorder, and even worse, the kind of treatment which people undergo in the name of psychiatric correction, when you have these problems, they arise out of an entire society, and therefore, if you want to deal with these problems, you've got to get rid of that. Now, finally, I would like to put one or two questions. It was said earlier that you've got the short term and the long term, or somebody behind me said that you can have feminist struggle, women's movement immediately for women to gain some kind of equality with men, or to remove the oppression of them by men. And then afterwards, as a second stage, a long-term stage, you can have revolutionary socialism, in which you really have a system of complete equality where all human beings have completely free access to the entire world. Now, this dichotomy between the short term and the long term is one which is not just put forward by the women's movement, it's one which is put forward by all the reform campaigns, such as Free the Petrol of Lead. Now, if we had a debate tonight between revolutionary socialists and people who want to free petrol of lead, exactly the same point would be put. Free petrol of lead now, because it can be done and it must be done because children are suffering brain damage as a result of it. And then afterwards, you can have revolutionary socialism. Now, I would like to put the point that in fact you've got to combine these things. Women who genuinely want to liberate themselves completely, if that's what you want to do, I would see, logically, have got no choice but to be revolutionary. It's as simple as that. That is logical. Now, therefore, what they've got to do is not just attack what they call men's oppression, they've actually got to look at the society as a whole. That's not to deny that men can be seen as oppressing women in certain situations. It's simply to say that you've got to look further from the end of your nose, that's all, to change society completely. So finally, I realise I'm being long-winded. I would like to put a question in particular to the speaker from Sparery regarding political affiliations. Now, I suspect that Susan Ideal isn't a member of the Labour Party, perhaps she is, perhaps she isn't. Nevertheless, many of the members of the Sparery Collective and other feminists are members of the Labour Party.
No members of the Sparery Collective.
There's my answer. But certainly many people who call themselves feminists, without a doubt, I know from experience, are members of the Labour Party. There are women who call themselves feminists, perhaps you would not call them feminists, but they call themselves feminists, who are members of the Liberal Party. There's no doubt about that. Who are members of the SWP, the Communist Party, the IMG, as was, all kinds of organisations. The question I'd like to put to both speakers is on this point. If a woman says that she thinks she's located the cause of the problem, and yet she still has a political affiliation, official or unofficial, direct or indirect, to a system, which you've got, in fact, until you oppose that system, then the question has to be asked, if all of the demands of the women's movement, if all of the women's movement's demands were met, were achieved, if members of the women's movement achieved what they want to achieve, what then would be the kind of society we would live in? Let's not be vague about it for once. Exactly what kind of society would it be? Would it still have the problems of mass starvation alongside potential plenty because people can't afford food? Would it still have the problem of war, constant war? Will it still have the problem of profit taking a priority over human needs, so that if somebody dies because they've been working with asbestos, that's tough luck because it's profitable? Would these things happen?
Can I say something first? Can I say a couple of things? One is that Sparery actually has a policy that none of the workers belong to a political party. Secondly, I thought that the example that you used of being sacked from your job by a woman actually raised an interesting point, because going back to what I said earlier about my politics as a socialist feminist and how I see that there are these two sort of interlinked systems of class society capitalism and patriarchy. I mean, I don't want to delve too deeply into the specifics of what your experience was, but I mean, I think that certainly in that position, a woman had power over you because she owned the business, because you were her employee, right? But I mean, I think the distinction can be made between that, where you were being sacked as a worker, and between many situations which occur in the labour force where women are sacked not just because they're workers, but because they're women, and because of the situation of being that being women has got them into. I mean, there are thousands of examples of women being sacked because they're pregnant, because they don't wear the right clothes, because they want to wear trousers to work, because they have the wrong hairstyle, because they don't behave appropriately according to what the ideal of what a woman should behave. I mean, you can go and look through the spare rib for the last 10 years and there are hundreds of cases of that happening. And I mean, I think that shows a distinction between how women and men are treated in this society, because on top of just being workers, there are also added the oppression is of women as women, not just as workers. And within that, we can look at women as part of the labour force who are actually manipulated by sort of capitalist forces. I mean, wonderful, I mean, a terrible example of that is the way women are actually brought in and out of the labour force. I mean, it's quite well described and analysed now as sort of like how women were brought into the labour force on a mass basis during the Second World War to take over the jobs that men had to go away to war, were conscripted to go off and fight. And then sort of like at the end of the Second World War, women were actually sort of dismissed from their jobs. But not only that, I mean, the whole of the sort of ideological machinery of these societies went into top gear to sort of convince women that what was going to make them really happy was having 5 children and consumer products in the home. I mean, this is not to say that men are not as much victims and puppets of that society as women are in that situation, but I mean, the experiences are different, and it's from that starting point, it's because they are in the position of being told, what their lives should be in a much more specific way, I think, than men are, that women start from that point to fight those specific things, the oppression as women. It's not just because they were workers. I mean, if women and men were all just workers the same, then why would it have been necessary to sort of shunt women out of the workforce? Why not just shunt X% out of the workforce after the Second World War? It doesn't work like that because society's not structured that way. And I've forgotten what you think. Oh, the ending question, which was about what sort of society would we end up with. I mean, I think that you can't take some sort of static view of here are the demands of the women's liberation movement. I mean, a lot of the demands that Christine mentioned weren't demands that I would subscribe to. I mean, the demand wages for housework. I mean, you cannot see the women's liberation movement or feminism as some huge monolithic structure which is in complete agreement and all fighting for the same thing, because, I mean, nothing in our society is like that. I mean, there are tensions and there are contradictions and there are differences and there are huge fights and disagreements within all sections of any radical movement, within the working class, within party, I mean, within socialism. I mean, look how many socialist parties there are. Within the women's movement, small L socialist parties. Within the women's movement, there are huge political differences. So, I mean, and the sort of fight in this society isn't a static one either. I mean, it's not, I mean, you can make huge sort of gains and victories in certain areas while people are being really repressed in other areas of their lives. And so in order to sort of say that, for me to sort of say what sort of society I thought we would end up with, I mean, I do have a picture of what sort of society we'd end up with, and it is a socialist society, but also within my concept of what a socialist society is, it probably differs quite radical from some others, from some other people's, because I would, and how we're actually, I mean, to me, it's a fantasy, it's fairly utopian, which isn't to say that I don't think it's worth fighting for, but I think that to say something like, in the end, we would have a socialist society is very different from saying, in the beginning, we have this situation and we're going to fight at this point, and what you define the situation is probably quite different depending on what your experience is and who you are in the society and what your politics are. And I mean, there are so many demands that haven't even been thought of yet. Because, I mean, we're sort of, there's a political movement at the moment saying, the anti-nuclear movement. So the anti-nuclear movement, the sort of peace movement. But, I mean, once we get past that, how do we, take apart the whole sort of industrial, nuclear, chemical, petro sort of industrial complexes? I mean, how do we sort of have the scientific expertise to take those things apart? I mean, those are things that all those struggles are things that have yet to be even met, and we have to even we haven't even got to the point in some ways of thinking through them, of coming up with what we want, because we're not even in a position to look at them yet. We're sort of starting from under it all, really. I mean, I just think, that's all.
Do you want to answer Cliff's original question?
No, I would like to make a couple of comments on what Susan said.
Or do you want to do that when you wind up?
Yes,
or is
okay.
It
well, I would have preferred to do it now, but
because we've got a lot of people wanting with this woman here.
Yeah, there's one point I'd like to make about the assumptions which are being used by women here who are saying, either like Susan is, that you fight for immediate reforms now and then later you talk about this utopian idea of socialism, or other people in the audience who are saying, well, who probably wouldn't even accept the idea of bothering with this future socialist society. And that is that if you concentrate your efforts on this immediate reform situation and taking men as enemies, then what you're doing, in fact, is you're accepting a set of values. You're accepting a politics of hate almost. And it's contradictory with this other aim that you've been talking about, because on the one hand you're saying that in my immediate situation, this man who is coming home every night and bashing me up is the enemy. He is the enemy, and I've got to do something about that. Right, fair enough, that's what you're saying. But then you're saying at some point in the future, I can work with men, or human beings as a whole have got some chance of working together, cooperating together, to do something about changing the world. Now, if you operate on this sort of level, where you blame that individual man for the oppression, which there's no doubt that he's inflicting on you as a woman, then you're actually acting in contradiction to the aim of working towards a different sort of society, where things like violence and aggression and oppression of all sorts are got rid of. You see, this is the thing about talking about. You've got to talk about it in terms of the system, because if you don't see it, that if you accept that violence, which women very often, feminists very often are doing, if you accept that violence is an inherent part of this system, and you fight it as women and meted out violence by men, and you don't look at the whole question of violence and what causes that, then you're not really answering any problems. And I think the point that's been made here time and time again by socialists, and which I would subscribe to, is simply that if you see a problem, which all the problems which have been mentioned here tonight, which face women, are problems which are caused by capitalism. If you see that problem, you don't fight men in the workplace, or you don't play around with. I mean, yes, you can do. You can play around with language to some extent. That doesn't change the basic situation. To change the basic situation, what you need to do is talk about the sort of society which will get rid of all the problems. And that doesn't involve having this sort of politics of hate, of sexism, because that's what it is. You're splitting men up and women at this point now and saying you're actually, continuing something which you're opposing. There's a contradiction in it. Feminists accept that these differences are between men and women and not just a whole range of human characteristics. And really, I think that what women ought to be doing is say, well, look, we want this other sort of society, and let's start talking about how we're going to get it. Not talk about hating men and what they can do to tinker with the details. Change the society.
I think we'll start winding up now. So if you want to take questions and wind up at the end, you know what I mean.
look at the questions and why
Just
not?
listen to all the
Yeah.
questions now. That's fine, yeah.
Is that
Yeah,
fine with you?
yeah.
Well, there are a few people that have had their hands up. Is it going to be short?
Yes, very true. Just a slightly different perspective on the discussion. I would argue, I don't see how you could possibly deny it, that at the world level, the worst and most severe problem affecting the female sex is hunger and starvation. They are dying every day and millions suffering from undernourishment. And this is a direct result of capitalist society. And if you continue to support capitalist society, just let me first say that this is something that socialism, not as a utopia, in a very, very easy and practical way could deal with immediately. Socialism could stop these hundreds of millions of women and female children that are suffering undernourished. They could stop that happening immediately. Couldn't raise world levels, food levels dramatically overnight, but at least it could stop these people dying immediately. Now, if you continue to support capitalism, because all the projections are this is going to get worse, the longer it goes on, the more members of the female sex will die of starvation in the foreseeable future. And if you continue to support the profit motive system of capitalism, then I don't see how you can get out of being responsible for condemning all these women, members of the female sex, to death in the foreseeable future.
It's actually 6 million female children every year. That's the current figure.
Thanks.
I just like feminists to see the world from my angle. When I first saw this sexism written up somewhere and equality for people, I thought I need equality with someone. Who do I need equality with? First person I looked at was the woman next to me. I said, I want equality with her because I don't want to go to the next war. I'll be in the front line, I'm sure perhaps I'll be in the rear line somewhere. I also looked and I said, there's a vast majority of people in prison, and I've seen it was men. Perhaps they're doing the time for a woman. I don't know. So I said to myself, perhaps I want equality, and I want a society which is not opposed to my sex, a better organised for a malist society. But I said there was nobody else around with the same ideas, because I looked at the woman next to me and realised she was just as much poverty as myself. So I said, well, where am I going to go support the women's movement so she can have a council house, which I have to keep busting the electric meter open to get the thing to work, to keep switching it off, or I should organise so she can be equal with me and join the police force and hit other members of the working class over the heads in a strike-breaking activity. I thought maybe I better organise for the woman next to me so she can join the armed forces, and next time the firemen are out of strike, she'll run about with a green goddess. I said, no, I better not do that. What will I do? I better do something for the people next to me. I better do something for me. It's organised for a society which doesn't recognise classes and doesn't recognise any real biological difference between the male and female, or black and white, pink or green. And I've also got another hang-up, which is the racist one. I'll get sacked for being, or not even get the opportunity to a job in a different part of my own so-called Great Britain, because I come from a northern part. You're likely to be a rebel if you come from the Clyde side. You got no much opportunity to work. So that's me from a racist point of view, I get knocked back, I get troubles, and also get troubles from a sexist point of view. How would the feminists see that?
Let's not start setting up hierarchies of oppression. I don't think we should get into that game, and I think it's began a bit this evening. You know, one person saying women in the workplace are oppressed. Women in the workplace are oppressed. He said, oh, well, he worked for a woman. He's a man in the workplace. He's oppressed. Someone said, what about women who are dying from starvation? Women who are dying from starvation, or someone else said, well, there are 6 million children, girls who are dying from starvation, not older women, but younger. Let's not start creating a league table of oppression. If you want to get into that game, you can go on all night, you can draw it up, you can draw a manifesto of oppression, wipe out this bit first, then that bit, and you gradually chip away at this abstraction, which you're all talking about, called oppression. Well, look, if men are the enemy of women, is it inevitable? If it's inevitable, then, as I'm a man, which is what it says on my birth certificate, that's all I've got. I haven't got a lot else to show for it. I haven't had any benefits written on me. I haven't had any benefits written on me as a result of it. I didn't even, in fact, discover it till I was about 17. But what I would say, if I'm a man and I inevitably oppress women, okay, I'm going to oppress you. I'm going to get together with other men, because I'm not interested in sympathising with other people's problems. I'm not into a sort of charity mission any more than anyone else would want to go into that kind of condescending, patronising political approach. I'm not going to go after black people, as incidentally some people on the left do, much to the annoyance of a lot of black workers, and sort of pat them on the head, say, you're oppressed, come and sit in the front row, comrade. We know you don't quite understand what our arguments are, but join the movement, become the leader, speak at the next meeting. I'm not going to do that. So if I am inevitably going to oppress women, I'm going to get together with other men and do my best to oppress them. The only thing about it is, I don't oppress women. I've never oppressed a woman. I've never talked to women. So the fact of the matter is, I don't talk to many men, incidentally. This is a discriminatory policy on my part. They don't talk to me. So the fact of the matter is, if it's inevitable, okay, let's get on with it. And if women, in the meantime, I don't know, the meantime between between tonight and when socialism descends from the sky like the second coming. But if, in the meantime, women are going to emancipate themselves from my oppression and the oppression of my sex, then I would say to the women present here this evening, not to the men, because they are supposedly on my side, get on with it. Good luck. The fact of the matter is, you won't succeed. It's an idealist, utopian mission, because it's not about values. It's not about values at all. The fact is, we are conditioned in this society into having certain kinds of personalities which function in order to keep this society running smoothly. And I've been conditioned to a great extent in that way. And I don't think that if I want to get on in a managerial position or a teaching position, I've got to adopt authoritarian attitudes. And on the other hand, if I want to get on with a boss, I've got to accept submissive attitudes. None of those come naturally to me. You have to learn them. That's why I have teachers, training colleges, and Hendon Police College to teach people to be authoritarian. You have to take people out of the dole queues in Glasgow, put them in the army and send them to Belfast, and actually teach these people who've never had any power in their lives how to act as if they're powerful, because they've got a gun in their hand. There's nothing natural about that. Now, if it's not natural, if the cause of this division is not natural, then it's caused by something which is the system. And that's why that bloke who said that Margaret Thatcher's running the system, or Indira Gandhi, they're not running the system at all. It's not a case of men or women. It's not a case of individuals. But then when Susan Argyle says, well, look, I like the way she smiles every time somebody mentions her name. That's conditioning as well, isn't it?
Just waiting for the
It's a fear condition. That's a fear conditioning, we all do it. But one of the things about that is that when she says, we're talking about a mass of people working, these are made up, the mass is made up of individual men and women, human beings. But a man is only a man, I would say, for a very limited part of his life. A male is actually only acting as a male in a very limited part of his life. A female is only acting as a female biologically for a limited part of their lives. What's actually happening is that people are acting in all sorts of different ways. And what unites people more than anything is the fact that they're members of a really oppressed wage slave class, because the majority of people haven't got the power to control the earth around them. And I'd say, given the choice between a police force, that beats people up, but does not discriminate on the basis of race and sex, and they're working hard. Brent Council has withdrawn its subsidy to the Hendon Police College until it promises to have a non-racist policy in beating people up. Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's not an end of oppression. That is a reorganisation of oppression. And I don't want to share poverty or to share oppression or to equalise it. And incidentally, it's an idealistic notion. People who are doing it are wasting their time. I might be wasting my time as a socialist, but if I am, I'm wasting my time for a different reason. If I'm wasting my time, it's because the majority of people are sufficiently conditioned to accept capitalism that they're not going to stand up and say, we're workers, we don't want to be slaves anymore, we want to take the earth into our own control. And I want women to do that, and men to do that, and I'm not going to look at their sexual organs while they're doing it. Just want them to do it with their brains, not penises or vaginas.
I'll now ask well, I was going to ask the speakers to wind up, and then you can continue the discussion in the pub if there's any more time. If it'll take less than 3 minutes.
Much less. Well, 2 points up if I've got 3 minutes. First, I think the socialists, from one point of view, could do a great deal by explaining to all women the nature of their oppression. In other words, I think many feminists wouldn't disagree with the sort of analysis that's been made tonight. I think one thing the feminist movement has done, though, is gave massive support. There are far more members of some kind of women's organisation than there are members of the Socialist Party of Britain. And I think that's something that the men might think about, the socialists might think about. Secondly, I think just one point of fact, patriarchy does predate capitalism by many thousands of years, in fact.
Right, if I'll ask the speakers to wind up.
I mean, maybe what I'm going to say is going to be repeating other things that I've said, but I just took down a couple. I mean, what I got out of all those questions and statements that were just made, what I took out of it was this, that I think it's the wrong use of words to say that feminism says that it's inevitable, to use the word inevitable in terms of looking at what oppression exists in this society is incorrect. And in fact, whenever anyone takes a step to fight against oppression, then they're saying that it's not inevitable. And it's not just a question of values, it's actually a question of how people act. Not just it's a question of how they think, but I mean how they think and what values they hold, which have been inculcated into them, which are reinforced in the society, also lead to them acting in certain ways and in keeping the society going. So I mean, when we look at movements that are trying to change the society, I mean, I don't think that it was the first woman who asked the first question, who's not here, was saying that it's not good enough to sort of be looking at reforms and sort of putting socialism off until after. But I don't think that I, as a socialist feminist or socialist feminists generally, do that. I mean, I think the whole point is that when you are acting politically, when you're fighting political fights, then you are trying to weigh up as far as possible what is the best possible thing to do at that point to win the greatest amount that you can for yourself, and to sort of break through into other areas, to sort of open up that struggle as far as possible, to take you as far along, to defeat as much as you can of what is facing you in that particular fight. And I think that to sort of simplify it and to think that people are only thinking in the here and now, you know, that I want my rent to go down £10 a week or whatever. I mean, I don't think that people may become involved in politics on those basic levels first, but I mean, I think that they quickly realise what they're up against and sort of start to think things through in much more complexity than that, or I would hope that, I mean, that's the whole point of political debate, so that those areas are widened up for everyone. And I think a lot of women do enter into the women's movement with just that sort of vague dissatisfaction or something's gone particularly wrong in their life when they join a women's group. But I mean, then the whole sort of way in which society is structured
hopefully becomes clearer to them. And I mean, I think that I have a view of politics and of political struggle and of movements within the whole society, which is that in fact people do act out of their own interests, and that they have different interests, and those interests, and that you're never, I think, going to get some great uniform mass socialist party which is all going to be acting for the one thing. And I don't think that even within a basically socialist economic structure that you will ever reach some sort of plateau where everybody sort of says, wonderful, this is it, we've got it for the next 1,000 years. There are always going to be different interests. There are always going to be conflicts in which you try and work out how to sort of have some sort of compromise between those interests, because just because of the huge differences which exist between people. And I think that one speaker raised the point about, I mean, I think that it's really false on that question of people acting from their own interest to sort of say, for example, that lesbians or homosexuals, say, just taking lesbians, that they oppress heterosexual women by making demands for their own freedom of sexuality.
Can you discuss it later on, please?
I mean,
just be quiet, Christ's sake.
I mean, one of the sort of most basic tenets of the women's movement is women's right to choose for their own body, and I mean, their body is how they exist in the world, and a lot of women's oppression is focused on their body, is focused on who they go to bed with, what they wear, whether they, I know, but I'm just making a broader point.
I mean, this is the function.
Well, I'm asking the speaker to turn up. If you fail to get your point of view across, you can do it later.
And I mean, women are going to make different choices for what they do with their lives, and those things may come into conflict, but they don't necessarily have to. And the fact that one group of women choose one particular way of living is not necessarily, doesn't discriminate against anyone. I mean that sort of just fits into my sort of broader view that in fact you are never going to have some sort of uniformity among everyone. People are going to choose different ways of life and have different struggles as they want to achieve that way of life. So I mean, that's just how. And another thing that came up in terms of this whole thing of looking at, it's the system that does this to us, and we can look at, say, the soldier who's taken from the working class and trained how to obey authority and trained to oppress other people on the streets of Belfast. I mean, we may have a very good understanding of how that happens and how that fits into this system, which is economically geared to imperialism, to exploiting other countries, and also to making its own economy run by having huge areas of the economy that are going into armaments and all that sort of thing. But I mean, given the fact that we might understand that to the nth degree, does that mean that we sort of, I mean, what is our position then as regards that soldier in Belfast? I mean, if you're an Irish person in Belfast, you don't, I mean, the Irish people in Belfast actually do have a very good understanding of that. But that doesn't mean they're going to stop fighting that man or those men or that army. And I think that's, you know, I mean, you can go so far with understanding, but when it's your own life which is at threat, or your own life which is being cramped under certain conditions, then you stand up and fight for yourself, and that's what women have done in the women's movement and will continue to do.
Would you like to? Yes. I'll take up again a few of the points that have come up in the last sort of 10 or 15 minutes. So we've heard quite a lot about the oppression of women, and as I said before, I don't disagree with it. Women are oppressed, there's no doubt about it, right? But on the other hand, we must look a bit further. One of the examples that Susan gave was that women can be sacked, for instance, for not wearing the right clothes. But what would happen, in your opinion, to a man who went to work in a pink frock? What would his employer say about that?
Call the police, I should think.
But what I mean, you see, I know it sounds a bit trivial, but what I mean is we've got to look further than the surface of things. We've got to see that the people who are oppressed are not just the women, they're all the people who do not conform. It so happens that with dress, men tend to conform and women have a much wider choice, so they can sort of look as if they're not conforming. It is if you don't conform that you're oppressed, just as fat people, as Steve was saying, or anybody who doesn't conform to the sort of ideal person that fits into the capitalist system that it's produced by the system in which we live. Now, another thing is, Susan said, and there are so many demands that haven't been thought of. Well, yes, of course there are, because every reform brings so many new problems that then you have all these new demands to solve the new problems. And so reformism can go on and on and on forever. There's no end to it. It's lovely for those who are reformists. They know that they'll never be out of a job, you see. No. Well, it's a bit repetitive as a career. It's you don't sort of go up. It's the same thing. But no, if you want anything to change, it's got to be real change, not reforms. They just lead to more of the same kind. Now, another point made by the lady over there was about the number of women in the feminist movement. Well, you know, by the way, when it comes to numbers, I mean, if that's what impresses you, you might, you know, the sort of the Maoists in China probably have the largest number, or the I don't know, you know, sort of moving like that. But let me just make another of my sort of building analogies. Imagine two groups of people trying to build a house, right? They get together and they start to build a house. On the one hand, you've got a very tiny group of people, and they know that they can't really build the house as long as they're only that number, that small number. But they've got the plan, and the plan is very clear, and they all agree as to exactly how they're going to do it and what it's going to look like and what it'll give everybody, right? And they know that as soon as enough people join them, who think like them, who agree with the plan, then it'll get done, and it'll get done very quickly then, because it's just a question of numbers. On the other side, you have another group of people building a house, and there it's a huge group, hundreds and hundreds of people, plenty enough to build a house, no problem. The only trouble is they all have a different idea as to what house they're building. So that while one is building a wall and gets to one end, another one is knocking it down to do something because he thought something else should go there. And so this is the trouble with numbers. It's all very well to have numbers. Like, you know, in the feminist movement or in the Labour Party, yes, you've got great numbers, but they all have different ideas of what they want. So they never achieve anything. Because what they have at the end is no house at all and no plan, you see. So, I mean, I'll just say again now, as a socialist, that socialists, like the small number of people building their house, have a very clear aim of what they do, and I disagree with Susan. I must say, I think all people have the same interests. My description at the very beginning of this talk of freedom, I am sure everyone would agree with that. To have control over your own life, and not to be threatened by destruction, by our external destruction, useless, gratuitous destruction. That is what people want. They all want the same thing. We all want the same thing. It's all the same interest. So all it takes is people getting together and deciding that they're going to get that. They're going to get that kind of freedom. It's not out of reach. All it takes is numbers, is people deciding that they're going to do it, they're going to fight for it, they're going to get other people to join them, and then they're going to vote for it, and then it's going to be there. Now, never mind about the next 1,000 years. I mean, I won't be there anyway. I want it now for myself. And in the next 1,000 years, people will have plenty of work putting right the mess that's around now. There's plenty of work, don't worry. And when that's done, then the creative energies of human beings will be loosened, and goodness knows what they'll have.